So if for any reason, if you get into the equation of creating that sense of insecurity, then you become the victim of the backlash, because making proving to others that you are not that great then becomes the agenda of the boss. When you look at toxicity, it gets triggered by aspects which are purely about insecurity.
Welcome to a new episode of Tell Me Why. If you're a returning listener or if you're a brand new listener, our show is about telling you why anything in the world that you may question. So we will ask each guest a Tell Me Why question related to their expertise. And we will dive deeper into the topic to answer all your questions and give you the advice that you need. Today's guest is Debu Mishra. He is with me today because we're going to talk everything careers today and in the future. He is going to be a returning guest. Debu, how are you? Welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
All right. So Debu actually has been doing this for quite some time. And the latest topic that we heard from you, or that we've read from you, is about overcoming a toxic boss.
Right.
What a headline. I think that is such a massive and powerful headline. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. It resonates with so many of our readers and our listeners. So tell me a bit more about that. Like, what came to mind when you decided to write an article about this?
So a bit of personal experience as well. As I had written in the article, most of us experience a toxic boss at some stage in our life.
Correct.
It's very rare that you'll get through your career without having, had the benefit of working with a toxic boss.
Benefit, yes.
There is a benefit, because once you know what a toxic boss looks like, then you begin to appreciate those who are not.
Who are not, okay.
And you know that you need to keep your relationship going with them.
That's the glass half full kind of look into it. Okay.
So the genesis of what makes a toxic boss starts with, I wouldn't blame people who are toxic bosses, because they most of the time don't even realize that how toxic they are and what they're doing to the teams.
Okay.
It happens when a leader or a boss gets too focused on the task at hand and ignores the people who he or she is working with and who's responsible for helping him or her get things done. So when the task becomes extremely important, you tend to, display toxic behaviors, which is pushing, creating stress, being too focused on the outcomes and the results, and not helping people understand the process of how to do things. But there is a darker side to toxicity, which becomes very, very dangerous when bosses tend to believe that their insecurities of how good or bad they are is fed by making others feel small, and therefore they feel superior. So the need to feel superior to the people that they lead sometimes spills over into the dark side of leadership, which is yelling and shouting and screaming and making others look small, so that they appear to be superior. They may not. In most cases, they are not. So toxicity has two elements to it: a very strong focus on the task and ignoring the people who will get it done. And the second is a very strong focus on the need to feel superior, and in the process destroying the people that you're working with, making them feel small. So a combination of this is extremely, extremely dangerous, and it starts to impact mental health, productivity, morale, all of those.
So that's actually like one of the questions that I had in mind is, how do you deal with that? Because certainly, like, having a toxic boss doesn't only affect your day-to-day operations in the company that you're in, but it also has much worse repercussions, like outside of work as well. You might find yourself, lashing out, or the repercussions just continue with you. So I wanted to ask you about that.
So the spillover is into family life, into your social circle, and water cooler conversation. So if you find in an organization, if people are constantly, meeting and talking in hushed tones near the water cooler or over a cup of tea, obviously they're trying to vent the stress
Mm-hmm.
that they have experienced. And at home, relationships start getting impacted because you're so stressed out
Mm-hmm.
that you transfer that toxicity into the personal relationships as well. So you get too caught up with work, and therefore you're ignoring your loved ones.
Yes.
The stress of the work starts impacting personal relationships. Health, as I said, that you'll get ulcers if you cannot speak up.
Mm-hmm.
You will see that you'll get ulcers and
Yes.
acid reflux. All of these are signs that
Yes.
you're trying to bottle in your stress and frustration.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why it happens, or the reason why it happens, is that in many organizations, the performance or the outcomes and results are over indexed in terms of importance,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore the high performers are given a free pass with their behavior.
Right.
And you'll see this repeated across almost all across the world in most organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And it is also very dominant in Asian and Western cultures as well,
Yeah.
where performance and money and compensation and stature and prestige become
Mm-hmm.
very, very signals of achievement.
Right.
In those societies and those scenarios, toxic behaviors are tolerated by the larger
Mm.
population.
Is it because industries or companies have become more number driven than quality maybe driven? Do you feel like, is it because people are focusing on the numbers and getting the most out of their employees rather than their well-being and the quality?
Yeah, it's a cascade effect. So you look at the stock prices, they are determined by analysts. Analysts look at the growth projections, the profitability,
Yeah.
and that then transfers to the board and the CEO, saying
Mm-hmm.
that how do I improve my numbers, how do I improve profitability,
Mm-hmm.
and all of these then dovetail into a very simple equation. Every leader is trying to ensure that they're getting more done with less,
Mm-hmm.
and they're achieving more with the same. So these are the
Right.
two, and that's a stress that's pushing stress down. So the markets, investors create stress for the board and the leadership.
Right.
The board and the leadership then ask the management team or the CXO team to deliver on that.
Mm-hmm.
And if the leaders are not equipped, or they haven't been trained and invested in how to deal with that pressure, they will just rain down on the people below them.
Yes.
So that's passing
Precisely.
the, the
Yes.
dark clouds rain down on the weakest of the lot, which is the
Yeah.
young and those who don't have enough or a strong enough voice in the organization. So it's all linked. It's all linked, and we live in a very achievement driven society,
Mm-hmm.
where the measure of success is faster cars, bigger houses, more
Right.
compensation, where you are holidaying.
Biggest, tallest, fastest,
Yes.
yeah, more
So
advanced.
that's a pressure, and that
Yeah.
reflects in toxicity
Yeah.
in the world of work.
Okay. So before we dive into how I overcome this toxicity and how I overcome a toxic boss, like what are some tips and tricks? Before we dive into that, I wanted to ask a question about a toxic boss that may not even be getting stress from above.
So it's a possible scenario that your manager or boss at that time felt threatened.
Okay.
So if your performance stood out amongst the others, so if it was only you,
Okay.
if your performance stood out and he wasn't receiving enough praise
Mm-hmm.
for what he was doing, then you were the threat
Oh,
to
okay.
his presence or
Mm,
even relevance in the team.
right.
Uh, when you look at toxicity, it gets triggered by aspects which are purely about insecurity.
Okay.
So if for any reason, if you get into the equation of creating that sense of insecurity, then you become the victim of the backlash, because making proving to others that you are not that great
Mm-hmm.
then becomes the agenda of the boss.
Okay.
If you are seen as doing fantastic job and there's not enough praise coming in the boss's way, then you become the problem, which needs to
Okay.
be solved by creating enough evidence
Mm-hmm.
that you are not that good.
Okay, so we've spoken about what characterizes a toxic boss. How do I overcome it? If I am today in a toxic environment, in a toxic work environment to be specific, and my boss is definitely making it worse, what are some tips and tricks?
First is, I would say that reflect upon, do you have enough evidence? So is there
Okay.
enough factual evidence, or do you feel that way? Is it your perception?
Mm-hmm.
So it's extremely important to know, like your case that you highlighted.
Mm-hmm.
If you were the only one receiving the toxic behavior, you should just check that, reconfirm that you're the only one.
Yeah.
And then go to the root cause of saying that why is it happening? Is it that, you're making the boss insecure?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason? Are you doing things in a way which is not acceptable to them
Mm-hmm.
or unpleasant? Are you leaving a lot of gray area where they are struggling to understand how they can be relevant to you? So it's a relationship.
Okay.
It's not transactional. So it's a relationship. Even their relevance for that boss-subordinate relationship has to be, dealt, looked into.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were to understand the facts as to it is actually just a toxic boss, irrespective of who they are interacting with, that's one analysis. Then you'll have to deal with it separately. If it is just you and the boss, and he or she is perfectly fine with everybody else, then that has to be dealt with separately, because it could be, you could have triggered, there could have been an instance or an event where you could have triggered a sense of insecurity or sense of unhappiness, for which you're receiving this behavior. So first, take the step of understanding what's causing it.
Okay.
Is it the person, or is it just the relationship, that's causing it? The second aspect is to go in, once you have understood that, to go into the reason or what is driving that behavior. So is it that you're not keeping the boss informed about what you're doing? Some people, and it's quite fair for leaders and managers, some people would like to be deeply involved. They want to know what's happening.
The micromanager types.
I would say that they are perfectionists, they have a standard, and therefore if they don't trust you to deliver to those standards, they would micromanage.
Okay.
And I say this with great confidence because I have been a micromanager in the past.
Okay.
So that's my justification
Right.
for being a micromanager.
Okay.
That you want to deliver a particular standard, and if you don't have faith in the individual that he or she would deliver to that standard, you tend to micromanage to ensure that those standards are going to be met.
We spoke about how to deal with them, and we spoke about the traits of toxic bosses, and we spoke about what may cause it, the implications it has on the employee. Now, there's a buzzword that's been trending quite a lot these days: gaslighting.
Right.
So I want to talk about gaslighting because I feel like it's one of the traits of a toxic boss. I feel like toxic bosses do gaslight their employees. Can you maybe tell us the different types of gaslighting and how bosses use or abuse it?
So gaslighting largely is feeding the insecurity of the boss.
Okay.
That's the only reason they would use it, and which I explained earlier, that the need to feel superior by making others feel small.
Okay.
And the ways in which somebody could do it, it's an immense, opportunity space for somebody who wants to do it. Public humiliation, always finding faults, completely disrupting lives of people. Like you set up a meeting and you don't turn up,
Yeah.
and you have made somebody prepare, over the weekend for a meeting, and you just don't turn up or cancel it at the last moment.
Right.
Now, somebody who spent the entire weekend preparing for it, just imagine how they feel. They feel miserable. So gaslighting takes various shapes and form, and largely driven to feel bigger, and by making somebody else feel smaller.
Okay.
In many cases, I work with leaders, and I keep telling them that if people hide the bad news from you, it's a danger sign. That means that they don't want to be shouted at. They don't want to be hauled up. And if you keep pointing out mistakes and shortcomings, so there are two types of review meetings that happen in organizations. One is where the entire meeting will focus on what did not get done, what was not achieved.
Right.
And there's another meeting where there will be a fair share of appreciation of, what was achieved, progress made, and a very positive and constructive discussion around wherever things didn't happen, how we could make it happen. So it's a feed forward of saying that great job, these were stuff done brilliantly, this is very good progress, let's now discuss what needs to be done, and here are possible ways in which you could possibly approach it, and let's review it and see so that we are able to achieve it.
Right.
The difference between the two scenarios is that organizations which have this approach of focusing on the negatives and what didn't happen, the bad news is brushed under the carpet, or it is hidden.
Right.
So people start hiding skeletons in the cupboard, and it never comes out till it's too late. That's a very unhealthy environment. Everybody is stressed because bad news is lurking all around, but it's not visible.
Yes.
And organization performance starts dipping because you're not focused on the right things. So my suggestion to people is that if you see gaslighting as a behavior, you need to point out to the leader what harm it will do for the business performance, for their own performance. If there is a way for you to highlight that, you could probably stem the gaslighting initially.
Okay.
But if it is just an individual, if it is not the organizational culture,
Right.
but if it is just an individual who does it, find an avenue. Most organizations have a healthy corporate governance approach where they have, a helpline, or they even have an anonymous whistleblower policy.
Yeah.
So do that so that the facts come out and somebody steps in and stems the rot early.
Okay.
So this would be the right approach, and otherwise you can't do much about it. If it is just the individual, we don't work in organizations to fix problem individual. We work in organizations to operate as a team.
Yes.
And focus on the larger good for the organization, which is dealing with toxic behavior as it needs to be dealt with.
Of course. Okay, so let's say I've done everything I could. I have spoken to my boss one-on-one, tried to figure things out, used all the tips that you've provided us today, yet I'm still dealing with the same problems over and over again. Maybe it gets better for a period of time, but we go back to square one. What is your advice for a person like that? Is it time to move on? Is it time to maybe explore other options? What is your advice?
Time to move on is when the organization says that they won't be able to deal with it.
Okay.
So if you get a response from the larger organization that this individual is a high performer, this individual is doing great, we can't really do much about your discomfort or unhappiness with it.
Yeah.
That's the time to move on, because it's not going to get, as I pointed out earlier, the investors, the stock markets, everybody else is putting enough pressure. They would rather deal with that than one unhappy employee.
Of course.
But if the larger organization is supportive, if the environment is healthy, it is important for you to find a new boss. And a new boss is need not necessarily outside the organization.
Okay.
You could move roles within the organization, go and work in another division or another team where the individual is known for being a great person.
Okay.
The second is to find a mentor within the organization. So somebody who will tell you how to deal with the situation, which will take a very constructive and positive approach of, fixing the problem by moving you to somebody else who's more nurturing and supportive. And the third and most important is that you ensure that you have documented it. It cannot be telephonic conversations, in-person conversations. Write it down, put it down in an email, share it with HR, share it with a leadership team member saying that, I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
I need some guidance. Can you suggest somebody who can guide me through this? Maybe I need to figure out a way of doing things differently.
Right.
So be constructive about it rather than complaining, but document it. The moment you document it, it becomes a priority for everybody to resolve it. Hearsay conversations which are not on record really never help.
Of course. Of course. I mean, everyone says have everything in written form so that you have something to present as proof. Okay, so mentioning that, actually, I remembered I have a friend who was complaining about her boss, who is actually quite inappropriate in the workplace, uses inappropriate language, and doesn't necessarily have a good relationship with any of the employees. I remember she went to HR and she complained, and they did take it seriously. However, nothing changed. What's the next step? What would your next advice be for her? Follow up, or what else can she do?
Be very explicit about it with the person whose behavior is inappropriate, and do it very explicitly,
Okay.
saying that, this behavior of yours, this is the impact it is having on me. It makes
Okay.
me feel, it is demeaning, it stresses me out, it causes a lot of mental trauma for me.
Right.
The next time around, I would expect you to, do it in this way. I would really appreciate it.
Okay.
Do it once or twice, thrice, and then register a formal complaint. Because sometimes the person on the other side doesn't know what impact or how serious it is.
Yeah.
Inappropriate jokes, inappropriate behavior, inappropriate language is sometimes seen as progress, and therefore it becomes a bragging right rather than seen as inappropriate behavior.
Yes.
So pointing it out and expressing your discomfort is extremely, extremely important as a first step.
It's been a pleasure just having this conversation with you. So many more questions have come to mind, but we will save those for next time, because we'll talk everything careers. Like, we'll talk about career progression. We'll talk about finding new skills. We will talk about these things with you again, Debu.
To the listeners, the most important thing is that you should be taking care of yourself. And only when you have taken care of yourself will you be in a position to do good work or to lead others. So take care of yourself. Don't get too stressed. Deal with the stress. If it is a toxic boss, deal with it appropriately.
Golden advice. I think that's spot on. Thank you so much. We look forward to having you back on. And to our listeners, you know the drill. If you want to send in any questions, podcast@gulfnews.com. If you want to suggest any topics that we could discuss with Debu, podcast@gulfnews.com. We will also link to Debu's article, which has been published on gulfnews.com. And we'll catch you guys next time. Thank you.